The winter winds cut through the Nebraska prairie like a rusted blade, and by mid-December the ground had frozen hard as iron. 37-year-old Daniel Brewer stood at the base of his tallest grain silo that morning, breath fogging in the bitter air, thinking about the collapsed corn inside. The kernels had crusted together near the bottom after moisture got in during the autumn rains, creating a solid mass that refused to flow through the auger. He'd been putting off dealing with it for weeks, but now the buyers were waiting, and his bank account couldn't afford any more delays. He told his wife, Rebecca, he'd be back in an hour. Their 2 daughters, ages 9 and 12, were still asleep in the farmhouse 200 yards away. Daniel climbed the exterior ladder of the 40-foot silo, the metal rungs slick with frost. At the top, he opened the hatch and peered down into the dim interior. The silo was about 2/3 full, maybe 15,000 bushels of corn. The crusted section was visible near the bottom, a hardened dome that needed to be broken apart. He lowered himself through the hatch, his boots finding purchase on the uneven surface of corn below. Before we continue with Daniel's story, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more incredible true stories of survival and courage. Daniel descended carefully, using a long metal rod to probe the grain ahead of him. The corn shifted under his weight with soft whispers, and he made his way toward the problem area near the center. He'd done this before, dozens of times over the years, always cautious, always aware of the dangers. But this time, something was different. When he thrust the rod into the crusted mass, it broke through with a sudden crack, and the entire structure beneath him collapsed inward like a trapdoor springing open. He dropped instantly, the corn rushing around his legs, his waist, his chest. He tried to throw his arms up, but the pressure was immediate and overwhelming. Within 3 seconds, he was buried to his armpits. Within 5 more, only his head remained above the surface. The corn had him in a grip tighter than concrete, the individual kernels locked together with a force that made movement impossible. He tried to scream, but the pressure against his ribcage made it hard to draw breath. The corn stopped flowing. Daniel hung there, suspended in the mass, his head just barely above the surface. He couldn't move his arms. He couldn't move his legs. The pressure on his chest made every breath a struggle. Panic seized him, his heart hammering against his compressed ribs, but he forced himself to think. His cell phone was in his jacket pocket, completely unreachable. The hatch was 40 feet above him. The walls were smooth steel, offering no purchase even if he could move. He shouted for help until his voice went hoarse, but the farmhouse was too far away, the silo walls too thick. The December wind howled outside, carrying away any sound that might have escaped. He thought about Rebecca and the girls, probably just waking up now, making breakfast, wondering when he'd come back inside. He thought about how long it would take them to realize something was wrong. He thought about how long it would take them to find him. Hours passed. The cold seeped through the silo walls, turning the air inside frigid. Daniel's exposed face began to numb, his lips cracking in the dry air. His throat burned from shouting. The pressure on his chest created a constant ache that radiated through his entire torso. He tried again and again to move, but the corn held him as firmly as if he'd been encased in cement. The exertion made him thirsty, desperately thirsty. But there was no water, nothing but corn stretching in every direction, above and below and all around. By noon, Rebecca began to worry. Daniel never stayed out this long without checking in. She bundled up and walked to the equipment shed, calling his name. No answer. She checked the barn, the machine shop, the storage building. Nothing. Finally, she noticed the open hatch at the top of the grain silo. Her stomach dropped. She climbed the ladder, her hands shaking, and shouted down into the darkness. Only silence answered her. The silo was too deep, the light too dim to see the bottom. She couldn't tell if anyone was down there. She ran back to the house and called 911, her voice breaking as she explained the situation. Within 20 minutes, volunteer firefighters from the county arrived, along with the sheriff. They climbed the silo and shouted down, their voices echoing in the metal cylinder. This time, from deep below, they heard a faint response. Daniel was alive, but getting him out would be nearly impossible. The fire chief, a man named Robert Chen, had never dealt with a grain entrapment before. He made calls, contacting agricultural rescue specialists 3 counties away. They explained the dire situation over the phone. Pulling Daniel out was not an option. The suction force of the grain would tear his body apart. They needed to remove the corn from around him, but the auger at the bottom was jammed. Cutting a hole in the silo wall could cause a structural collapse that would bury Daniel completely. They needed specialized equipment, grain rescue tubes, and personnel trained in this exact scenario. It would take hours to assemble everything, maybe a full day. The rescue team arrived as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the frozen prairie. They brought grain vacuum equipment, rescue tubes made of interlocking plastic sections, harnesses, and rappelling gear. 6 firefighters descended into the silo on ropes, headlamps cutting through the darkness. When they reached Daniel, they found him barely conscious, his face gray with cold and exhaustion. He'd been trapped for 8 hours. They worked through the night, assembling the rescue tubes around Daniel's body, creating a cylinder that would keep the corn from pressing in on him while they vacuumed out the grain. The tubes sank into the corn slowly, section by section, requiring constant adjustment. The vacuum roared, sucking up corn kernel by kernel, the process agonizingly slow. Every few hours, they had to stop to prevent the equipment from overheating. Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, his body shutting down from hypothermia and dehydration. Rebecca stood at the base of the silo through the night, wrapped in blankets, refusing to go inside. The girls stayed with a neighbor. She listened to the muffled shouts of the rescue workers, the mechanical whine of the vacuum, the metallic clanging of equipment. Every hour, someone would climb down and give her an update. He's still alive. We're making progress. It's going to take time. She nodded each time, her face blank with shock, her hands gripped together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. By dawn of the 2nd day, they had removed enough corn to get a harness around Daniel's chest. But when they tried to lift him, his body wouldn't budge. The corn below his waist still held him fast. They needed to remove more. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. The vacuum continued its work, the pile of extracted corn growing outside the silo. Finally, 16 hours after the rescue began, 24 hours after Daniel first fell, they pulled him free. His body was limp, his skin pale and cold. They strapped him to a rescue board and hauled him up through the hatch, inch by inch, the ropes creaking under the weight. At the top, paramedics were waiting. They loaded him into an ambulance and rushed him to the regional hospital 40 miles away. Rebecca rode in the front seat, her hand pressed against the window, watching the frozen landscape blur past. She didn't know if her husband would survive. 24 hours trapped in a grain silo, 24 hours without food or water, without warmth, without movement. The human body could only endure so much. But this is not the story of a rescue that took 24 hours. This is not the story of what did happen. This is the story of what could have happened. This is the story of what would happen if that rescue never came. If the circumstances had been different, if the timing had been worse, if Daniel Brewer had been alone on a more remote farm, farther from help, discovered later. This is the story of 16 days. The day Daniel Brewer fell into his grain silo was December 14th, a Saturday. He'd told Rebecca he was going to check on the equipment in the barn, not the silo. He'd changed his mind at the last moment when he saw the frost building on the metal structure and realized he needed to deal with that jammed corn before the next cold snap made everything worse. He didn't tell her about the change of plans. It was a small decision, meaningless at the time, that would alter everything that followed. When Rebecca noticed he was missing, she assumed he'd driven into town for parts. He did that sometimes, without mentioning it. The girls needed supplies for a school project Monday, and she figured he was taking care of errands. She didn't start worrying until late afternoon, and even then, she thought maybe he'd stopped at his brother's farm 30 miles south to help with some repair work. That happened occasionally. By nightfall, she was concerned enough to call the brother, who hadn't seen Daniel. She called the hardware store, the feed supply, the neighbors. No one had seen him. She reported him missing to the sheriff's department at 9 that evening. They took the report, but explained that adult men often left for a day or two without telling family. They'd start looking if he didn't turn up by Monday. Rebecca spent the night awake, checking her phone every few minutes, calling Daniel's cell over and over. It rang and rang, the sound echoing somewhere out in the darkness of their property. But she couldn't pinpoint the location. The farm was 200 acres of buildings, equipment, and frozen fields. The ringing could be coming from anywhere. Inside the silo, Daniel had already been trapped for 12 hours. The initial panic had faded into a kind of grim acceptance. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. He could barely breathe. The pressure on his chest forced him to take shallow, rapid breaths, never quite getting enough oxygen. His throat was raw from shouting, and he'd given up on that after the first few hours when it became clear no one could hear him. The cold was the worst part. The December air inside the silo hovered just above freezing, and his body heat was leaching away into the corn surrounding him. He'd urinated sometime around hour 6, unable to hold it any longer, the warmth spreading briefly through his jeans before turning cold and clammy. His stomach cramped with hunger, and his mouth was so dry his tongue felt like leather. He tried to think about his family, about staying alive, about anything other than the crushing pressure and the cold and the thirst. But his mind kept drifting, exhaustion pulling him toward unconsciousness. He fought it. He knew somehow that if he fell asleep, he might not wake up. Sunday morning arrived. Rebecca searched the property with the girls, calling Daniel's name, checking every building, every vehicle. They found nothing. The sheriff's deputy arrived around noon and walked the grounds with her. He was thorough, professional, asking questions about Daniel's state of mind, whether they'd been fighting, whether there were any financial troubles. Rebecca answered everything, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The deputy checked the silo, climbing the ladder and shouting down, but the acoustics were poor, and Daniel, now 30 hours into his entrapment, could barely summon the strength to respond. His voice came out as a croak, inaudible from 40 feet away. The deputy concluded that Daniel had likely left of his own accord and would return soon. He promised to file a report and keep an eye out. Rebecca wanted to scream at him, to demand a full search, to insist something was wrong. But she was a farmer's wife in rural Nebraska, raised to be polite and not make a fuss. She thanked him and watched him drive away. Then she went back inside and tried to figure out what to do next. She called Daniel's parents, who lived 2 states away. They said they'd drive out first thing Monday morning. She called every friend and acquaintance she could think of. No one had seen him. In the silo, Daniel had discovered the drip. A tiny leak in the roof seal, far above him, was allowing moisture from melting frost to collect and drip down the interior wall. The droplets fell every few minutes, hitting the corn surface near his head. It took him hours to maneuver his mouth close enough to catch them, tilting his head at an agonizing angle, his neck muscles screaming. But when the cold water finally touched his cracked lips, it was the most precious thing he'd ever tasted. He caught the droplets one by one, sometimes waiting 10 minutes between each. It was barely enough to wet his mouth, certainly not enough to truly hydrate him, but it was something. It was survival. He also realized he could reach the corn with his mouth. The kernels near his face were dry and hard, but he could gnaw on them, working them slowly between his teeth until they softened enough to swallow. They were nearly impossible to digest in this form, and they tore at his throat going down, but they gave him something to focus on besides the pain. He ate one kernel every hour, rationing them like precious gems, trying to give his body any calories he could manage. It was absurd, being trapped in thousands of bushels of corn and slowly starving. But the corn in its dry state was almost inedible. His jaw ached from the effort of chewing. His throat burned from swallowing. But he kept at it. By Monday morning, Daniel had been trapped for 60 hours. Rebecca's parents-in-law arrived, and together they organized a proper search. 20 neighbors showed up with flashlights and ATVs spreading across the property in a grid pattern. They checked the tree line, the creek bed, the far pastures. They walked every inch of the farm. Someone checked the silo again, climbing to the top and looking down with a flashlight. The beam couldn't penetrate deep enough to show Daniel's position, buried 15 feet below the surface of the corn. The searcher saw nothing but grain and climbed back down. The local news ran a story that evening. Missing farmer, 37 years old, last seen Saturday morning. Rebecca gave an interview, pleading for information, her voice breaking. She couldn't understand where he could have gone. He wouldn't just leave. Something had happened. She knew it in her bones. But the deputy's words echoed in her mind. Adult men leave sometimes. They come back. Maybe he needed space. Maybe there were problems she didn't know about. Maybe she didn't know her husband as well as she thought. Daniel heard none of this. He was slipping in and out of delirium now, his body beginning to shut down. The cold had penetrated deep into his core. His fingers and toes had lost all sensation. The pressure on his chest created a constant grinding pain that never eased. He'd stopped being able to feel his legs entirely, which frightened him. He imagined the blood flow cut off, the tissue dying, gangrene setting in. If he somehow survived this, he might lose his limbs. If he survived, the if was getting bigger every hour. But the drip kept falling, and the corn was still there, within reach of his mouth. He clung to these two things. Water and food, the most basic elements of survival, delivered in quantities so small they seemed like mockery. But they were enough to keep him conscious, enough to keep his heart beating, enough to keep him alive for one more hour and then another after that. By Tuesday, the search had expanded to include the state police. They brought in tracking dogs, which picked up Daniel's scent leading to the silo and stopping. The handlers assumed he'd simply walked there and then gone somewhere else. Scent trails were often confused around farm equipment and livestock areas. They moved on to other locations. A helicopter flew overhead, scanning the property with thermal imaging, looking for a body in the fields or woods. They found nothing. Daniel was directly beneath them, 40 feet below ground level inside a steel cylinder, his body temperature so low he barely registered as a heat signature, even if the equipment could have penetrated the silo walls. Rebecca was fracturing. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except where Daniel might be. The girls stayed home from school, huddled together in their room, crying and confused. Well-meaning neighbors brought casseroles and offered theories. Maybe he'd had a breakdown. Maybe he'd been in an accident somewhere on the back roads. Maybe he'd driven to another state and lost his memory. Every theory sounded as impossible as the last. Rebecca kept returning to the silo, standing at its base, looking up at the metal structure. Something about it drew her attention, but she couldn't articulate what. It was just a silo, one of 3 on their property, filled with corn. What could it tell her? Inside, Daniel was barely human anymore. 6 days trapped, his body was eating itself, burning through fat reserves and then muscle tissue to stay alive. The tiny amounts of water and corn were not enough. He was dying by inches. His thoughts had become fragmentary, disconnected. He saw his daughters as children, as babies. He saw his wedding day. He saw his father teaching him to drive a tractor when he was 12. The memories were more vivid than reality, more present than the cold and the pain and the crushing pressure. He welcomed them. They were better than being here, trapped, dying alone in the darkness. But some stubborn part of his brain kept fighting, kept catching the droplets of water, kept gnawing on the dry corn kernels, kept breathing, shallow and rapid, never quite enough but never quite failing. His body was a machine that refused to shut down, even when shutting down would have been a mercy. He hung in the grain, suspended between life and death, as the days stretched into a week. Wednesday brought a cold front that dropped temperatures below zero. The drip in the silo froze solid. Daniel spent an entire day without water, his lips cracking and bleeding, his tongue swollen. He tried to lick the frost forming on the corn near his face, but there wasn't enough moisture to make a difference. By Thursday morning, the temperature had risen slightly and the drip resumed. He wept when the first drop hit his lips, actual tears running down his filthy face, the salt stinging his cracked skin. The water had become his god, his entire world reduced to waiting for the next drop, the next tiny sip of survival. The search had scaled back by the end of the first week. The state police concluded that Daniel had likely left voluntarily or been involved in an accident far from the property. They checked hospitals throughout the region, checked unidentified bodies in morgues, checked arrest records. Nothing matched. Rebecca filed a missing person report with the FBI, but they had no evidence of foul play, no reason to suspect kidnapping or murder. He was just gone. One of thousands of American adults who vanish every year, most of whom eventually turn up alive, some of whom never do. By the beginning of the second week, Daniel had lost perhaps 40 pounds. His face was skeletal, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. The corn around his head was smeared with blood from his cracked lips, and the sores forming on his cheeks where the grain pressed against his skin. He'd developed infections in multiple places, his body too weak to fight them off. Fever came and went in waves, making him shake despite the cold, his teeth chattering uncontrollably when the pressure on his chest allowed enough movement for that. He hallucinated constantly now. He saw Rebecca standing at the edge of the corn, reaching for him. He saw his daughters playing in the grain, laughing, their voices echoing. He saw his mother, dead 5 years, sitting beside him and singing the hymns she'd loved. He talked to all of them, his voice a rasping whisper, explaining that he was still here, still fighting, still trying to get home. They never answered. They faded like smoke when he tried to focus on them, but they came back again and again, keeping him company in the darkness. On December 23rd, 9 days after Daniel's disappearance, Rebecca decided to empty the silos. She needed to do something, anything, to feel like she was moving forward. The farm still had to function, bills still had to be paid, livestock still had to be fed. She called a grain hauler and scheduled them to come after Christmas. The corn would be sold, the silos cleaned out, and maybe in the process of that work she'd find some clue about where Daniel had gone. It was irrational, she knew, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was somewhere on this property, somewhere she hadn't looked closely enough. Christmas passed in a blur of grief. The girls opened presents without enthusiasm. Rebecca went through the motions, cooking a meal no one ate, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The neighbors had stopped calling. The police had stopped searching. Life was moving on without Daniel, and Rebecca felt like she was drowning in the unfairness of it. How could he just be gone? How could there be no trace, no explanation, no closure? She lay awake Christmas night staring at the ceiling and decided that on the 26th she would go through the silo herself. She would climb down into it with a ladder and a flashlight and search every inch. It was dangerous, she knew, but she had to do something. Daniel, on his 10th day trapped, no longer knew what day it was. He no longer knew how long he'd been here. Time had lost all meaning, collapsing into an eternal present of pain and cold and thirst and hunger. The drip still fell. He still caught it. The corn was still within reach. He still chewed it. These actions were automatic now, divorced from conscious thought. His body operated on instinct alone, the hindbrain keeping the basic functions going while his conscious mind wandered through memories and hallucinations and the grey space between. His kidneys had likely failed by this point, his body retaining toxins that should have been filtered out. His heart rate was erratic, skipping beats, racing and then slowing to barely perceptible. His lungs crackled with fluid that he couldn't cough up, the pressure on his chest preventing the deep breaths needed to clear them. He was dying, had been dying since the moment he fell, but the process was taking so much longer than anyone would have thought possible. The human body's capacity for suffering, its stubborn refusal to quit even under impossible conditions, was both remarkable and cruel. December 26th dawned clear and brutally cold. Rebecca bundled up in layers of clothing and walked to the silo at dawn. She had a ladder, a high-powered flashlight, and a rope tied around her waist. She'd told her father-in-law what she was doing, and he'd insisted on standing at the base to help if something went wrong. She climbed the exterior ladder, the metal rungs burning her hands even through thick gloves, and opened the hatch at the top. The smell that wafted up was foul, a mixture of rot and human waste and something else, something organic and wrong. She descended slowly, the rope paying out behind her, the flashlight beam cutting through the dusty air. The corn surface was 15 feet below the hatch. She lowered herself onto it carefully, testing her weight, remembering all the warnings about grain entrapment she'd heard over the years. The surface was crusted and uneven. She swept the flashlight around, looking for anything unusual. The beam passed over a section of corn that was stained dark, matted with something that didn't belong. She moved closer, her heart beginning to pound. "Daniel?" Her voice echoed in the metal cylinder. No answer. She moved closer to the stained area, the flashlight trembling in her hand, and then she saw it. A face, barely recognizable, caked with dried blood and filth, the eyes closed, the skin grey. She screamed, the sound bouncing off the walls, and nearly fell backward. Her father-in-law was shouting from below, his voice muffled. She couldn't answer. She was scrambling toward her husband, slipping on the uneven corn, the flashlight dropping from her hand and rolling away. She reached him and pressed her fingers against his neck, feeling for a pulse. For a long moment, there was nothing, and then, faint as a whisper, she felt it. A single beat, another. He was alive. Impossibly, inexplicably, against every law of nature and medicine, Daniel Brewer was still alive after 12 days trapped in a grain silo. She screamed for her father-in-law to call 911, her voice breaking with hysteria. She tried to dig around Daniel's body, but the corn was packed too tightly, her hands making no progress. She held his face, talking to him, begging him to hold on, telling him help was coming. His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused, unseeing, and then closed again. His breathing was so shallow she could barely detect it, but he was breathing. He was alive. The emergency response was massive this time, every lesson learned from previous grain entrapments put into immediate practice. Fire departments from 3 counties converged on the farm. Agricultural rescue specialists arrived with grain vacuum equipment and rescue tubes. An ambulance stood ready, along with a helicopter to airlift Daniel to the trauma center. The operation took 6 hours, the rescuers working with desperate precision to free a man who, by all rights, should have been dead a week ago. They pulled him out at 2 in the afternoon on December 26th, 16 days after he fell. His body was a ruin, skeletal and broken, covered in infections and frostbite injuries. The doctors who examined him at the hospital couldn't understand how he'd survived. 12 days without significant food or water, exposed to near freezing temperatures, trapped in a position that should have caused organ failure within days. But the drip had provided just enough hydration to keep his kidneys functioning at a minimal level. The corn, though nearly indigestible, had provided a trickle of calories, and his body, through some combination of genetics and sheer stubborn will, had refused to give up. He spent 3 months in the hospital recovering. He lost 8 toes to frostbite and suffered permanent nerve damage in his hands. His lungs were scarred from the infections and the prolonged pressure on his chest. He required months of physical therapy to learn to walk again, his legs having atrophied during the 16 days of immobility. The psychological scars were deeper and would take years to heal. He woke screaming from nightmares about being trapped, about the cold, about the crushing pressure. He developed severe claustrophobia and couldn't enter enclosed spaces without panic attacks, but he was alive. Against odds that medical professionals described as astronomical, Daniel Brewer had survived 16 days trapped in a grain silo by siphoning drip water and eating dry corn. The story made national news, studied by agricultural safety experts and emergency responders. Changes were implemented in grain bin safety regulations across the country. Warning systems, mandatory communication protocols, regular checks for solo workers. Daniel's suffering led to protections that would save lives in the future. Rebecca never went into a grain silo again. She hired workers to handle anything involving the bins and eventually sold that section of the farm entirely, unable to look at the structure where her husband had nearly died. The girls grew up with a father who was there but changed, marked by his ordeal in ways that never fully healed. Daniel himself struggled with guilt over the worry he'd caused, the trauma his family endured, even though none of it was his fault. Survivor's guilt, the therapist called it, common in people who lived through events that should have killed them. Years later, when asked how he survived, Daniel's answer was always the same. He didn't know. He remembered the first few days with clarity, the panic and pain and desperate thirst. He remembered the drip, the corn, the hallucinations. But most of the 16 days existed in his memory as fragments, disconnected images without context or chronology. His body had kept him alive when his mind had given up. The human will to survive, operating at a level below conscious thought, had carried him through when nothing else could. The farm still operates today, run by Daniel and Rebecca's daughters, who took over when their parents retired. The silo where it happened was torn down years ago, replaced by modern storage facilities with safety features and monitoring systems. But the story persists in the community, told and retold, a legend of endurance and survival. 16 days in a grain silo. 16 days that should have ended in death, but somehow didn't. 16 days that proved the human body's capacity for survival exceeds anything medical science fully understands. And somewhere in Nebraska, on cold December mornings, when frost builds on metal structures and the wind cuts across the prairie, farmers think about Daniel Brewer. They check their equipment one more time. They tell someone where they're going. They take the extra precaution, the extra minute, the extra step, because they know how quickly everything can change. They know how easily a routine task can become a fight for survival. They know that the difference between coming home and disappearing forever can be as simple as a single moment, a single decision, a single fall into grain that turns solid as concrete and holds you fast while the world moves on above, unaware that you're trapped below, fighting to stay alive one drop of water at a time.